Okay, and then we have Canada.
Canada, okay. A lot of very similar themes. In the big cities, really Vancouver and Toronto, most first-time buyers are priced out of the market. It's too expensive. The two factors are the cost of land and the cost of construction. Cost of construction, there's so much construction and market housing going on, expensive market housing, that getting skilled tradespeople to do construction in those cities becoming much more expensive. On the question of mortgages, just to build on your points, Christian, there are rules. You can still get a very low rate of interest on a home buyer's mortgage, but the banks are required to conduct a sensitivity test, and that test says, okay, if interest rates went up by 200 basis points, 2%, would you still be able to afford to own that house? Which to me makes sense, actually, it does. Household debt is very high in Canada, but mostly it's not a problem because it's underwritten by the equity that people have in their homes. So you may have, the fear in Canada is when you are using the equity in your homes to buy non-durable goods like cars and things like that. That's very dangerous, right? A house generally will appreciate or keep its value. Canadian government did come up with something in this year's budget whereby the government become a co-owner of your home. It's a shared equity model. There are limits on the actual value of the property, and there are limits on the household income. If you have an income above $120,000 a year, you don't qualify. I don't think it's a very good idea because I think in the short term it creates inflation in the housing market, so it's a self-defeating solution. Some people disagree with me, but the thing I think is most interesting going on in Canada right now is land trust. City of Vancouver, where I lived for a very long time, used to lease out land at 60% of its actual purchase value to co-ops. It recently leased 4 parcels of land for $1 each for 100 years to a land trust, okay? And that land trust has been partners with different kinds of lenders, with the BC government and the what we call mezzanine lenders. People will come in for a while, they'll lend money, they don't want a return on it, but they want to be paid out with interest in, say, 7 years. That started now emerged as a sort of partnership model, which is a little bit what inspired me to sort of suggest this idea for Wednesday morning, whereby affordable housing can get built, but using different forms of income mixing, tenure mixing, so that you've got one part of a project will, to some extent, subsidize another. It'll make money and it'll help you house poor people, people with disabilities, people for other reasons are financially marginalized. And that's working really well and it's growing, but it's only really happening in the city of Vancouver. There still remains an incredible affordability gap for the regular person working in, say, a department store, and even the rents that are being charged in these cities, which are incredibly high. So, yeah, we have a major housing problem in Canada too, but there are some interesting solutions happening in pockets, but I think it'll grow. That's it from me. You?
Any question?
Questions here.
No questions for me. Either it was really boring or it was brilliant.
Too fast.
Well, you told me to go fast.
Susie?
You can slow down.
Slow down. Yeah, he talks really fast.
I have a question about these smaller financiers who give money for a short period of time, 5 or 7 years.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yes, I can.
That's the mezzanine funding.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, but mezzanine funding usually, I'm going to slow down here, usually refers...
Mezzanine, like the floor, you know,
It's
whatever.
somewhere between the first floor and the second floor.
Yeah.
Usually refers to what private market developers use from high interest, high risk lenders. What's happening here is there's a couple of organizations that are able to raise money just in the bond market, okay, and then use that money to, say, lend, I'll make it up, 10% of the purchase price or the value of the property. This is for non-profit development, for co-op development. And they will then leave that money in there as what we call patient capital. In other words, capital of the debt that doesn't need to be serviced for 5, 7 years, whatever the period is. But the interest rate clock does tick during that time. But it's entirely designed to help develop affordable housing. It's not to help markets, developers with their market housing. It's designed to help non-market buyers or renters get into afford the housing, really. And because you can borrow that slice of money, it doesn't have to have debt service, your operating costs go down in that period. And in any new development, the most difficult period to cover all of your operating costs, including debt, is the first 5 to 7 years. After that, in normal housing markets, your property will already be worth more than it costs to build it. And therefore you can go out to a conventional lender, like a bank, and borrow that mezzanine financing and then repay the original lender.
And these lenders are like financial market actors?
No, they are non-profit housing market actors who understand the world of finance very, very well, and which is not a combination you find everywhere. You really have to understand what you're doing to do that. Yeah.
And in something that you said, that I got the impression that lending or borrowing in Canada is basically a variable interest rate loan. Is that okay?
No, it can be fixed, it can be variable, depending on, if you're just a home buyer, you have to decide what risk you want to take. Do you want to go for a fix, in which case you probably pay a bit more than the current variable rate, but then you have that insulation against interest rate fluctuations. That said, in Canada, interest rates are remaining consistently low as they have been for the last 10 years. The Bank of Canada is not increasing its overnight rate, which affects the bank lending rate. Yeah, so it's very low. You can still borrow mortgage financing under 4%.
Which is quite high.
Yes, well, it is actually, but it's closer to 3 actually. But what that tends to do then is push up the price of the housing because you can afford to borrow more. So that's the
At the moment.
At the moment, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.